destroyed the myth that there's a consensus of the American people to oppose drugs and to be willing to sacrifice their human rights in order to fight drugs. And Proposition 215 sent a clear message that has swept across America till 7 states today have legalized medical marijuana.
Good job.
But guess what? No matter how clear the message is, you cannot count on thick-headed morons getting it. And as a result, we've learned a lot about the police and the district attorneys in the state of California. I wrote a book called Hemp for Health that shows how we have 10,000 years of humanity using cannabis for medical purposes. So we have 5,000 years of documented medical use of cannabis. That into the 19th century, that cannabis was one of the top 2 or 3 drugs used for over 100 health conditions, and that doctors recommended it as a replacement for other drugs because it was so safe, so non-toxic, so effective. Looking for negative health effects, starting in India with the Raj Commission in 1894, followed by the study that was done by the United States Army in 1930s down in Panama, followed by a study done in New York State by the LaGuardia Commission, and followed by studies in the 1950s, in the 1960s under Kennedy and under Johnson, and in 1972 under President Nixon. The United States government did a study, the most comprehensive study. They found no health hazards from marijuana except for the possible risk of bronchitis. And other than that, they recommended that the laws should be changed to allow adults to possess and to use marijuana. Well, unfortunately, we had a thick-headed moron for president at the time. His name is Richard M. Nixon. And I know he's from this state, and he's buried in this state. And if you get a chance to dance on his grave, I recommend that you do it. But anyway, Mr. Nixon said that he was morally opposed to the issue of marijuana, and so therefore he would not follow the scientific studies that his own commission had done. He was so morally opposed to it that he had to go off and set up and rig the election in 1972 and steal the election and get thrown out of office for it. That's how moral he was in his opposition to the use of marijuana by hippies. But anyway, the studies have gone on and on. In the 1980s, the National Academy of Science did its studies, the Institute of Medicine did studies, the Health and Human Services did studies, and again they still fail to find any reason why marijuana should be listed in the Controlled Substance Act at all, let alone as a Class 1 drug, which means it's the most dangerous drug and has no medical value. Well, by the time we got to the situation of 1989 in California, the Resistance Advisory Panel of the Attorney General looked at the history of the drug war in California, and they came to the conclusion that the best thing to do would be to allow adults to grow and use their own marijuana. And that set the stage for what's happened in 1988. Also, the DEA had its own administrative law judge, Francis Young, take a look at medical marijuana, and he studied all the medical record, and he came to the conclusion that cannabis is the safest, one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to mankind, safer than many foods that we eat, including potatoes. And then, of course, George Bush became president for a while, and we had this terrible regression. And then when Bill Clinton got elected, everybody thought, well, this guy used to smoke pot. He's on TV joking with Arsenio Hall about how he wished he could have inhaled, but he couldn't figure out how to. Did I say something on thick-headed morons? I don't want to go on about that. But let's just say that somebody who can't figure out how to inhale marijuana and thinks it's very funny that he smoked marijuana when he was young, then went on to become the president who has overseen the greatest explosion in incarceration in the history of the United States. That a president who was raised by an unwed mother living on welfare then signed the slashing of welfare to more people and the destruction of the welfare program that would protect other children who were in this same circumstance, and did it with a smile on his face. That's the same president who went to college and tried out pot there signed a law that said that any college student who's caught with marijuana loses their government funding for their education. That a president who was raised with government subsidies of housing then signs a bill that says that not only can pot smokers be thrown out of public housing, but if someone comes to a house of someone living in public housing and then is to visit them and then smokes marijuana outside the house without the knowledge of the person in the home, that person living there can be evicted. Makes no sense except for one thing. It says who's calling the shots in America? We thought it was the voters. We went to the polls, we passed Proposition 215, and then we found out that indeed we may have state police, but that does not mean that we're not living in a police state.
Oh, we are.
Because the United States government, which is dedicated to the principles of the Bill of Rights, has chosen instead to emasculate those Bill of Rights, to destroy the Bill of Rights. And the people we're talking about today, specifically all the medical marijuana patients, but let's just go to people like Todd McCormick and Peter McWilliams. The Sixth Amendment says that in court you are allowed to challenge and to face anyone who accuses you of a crime. And what's the basis of this indictment? A confidential informant whose name has never even been brought forth, let alone the person. We are in a situation today where the 10th and the 11th articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed by the United Nations and binding to the United States as a member of the United Nations, states that a person has the right to a full access to every aspect of protecting their defense in court. And yet what do we find when Peter and Todd go into court, but they are not even allowed a medical defense in a state which has overwhelmingly approved medical marijuana? And then the United States goes and Clinton criticizes China for prison labor. The United States has prison labor. The United States has the biggest prison population in the world. 2 million people in prison today in the United States.
Don't mix your issues.
It isn't. How can you, it's the same issue. They're locking up corrupt.
So a bunch of these people are in prison as a result of things that should not have been charged against them in the first place. And it includes people like Will Foster in Oklahoma, who was caught with medical marijuana grow. He was not allowed to present a medical marijuana defense and wound up with 90 years in prison as a result of that. 93 years in prison without having the jury hear the defense. But as we stand here today talking about this, I have to tell you that we have made progress. That this year we're starting to see a turn in the way the juries are beginning to look at the medical marijuana issue. That the juries are starting to say enough is enough. And that patients around the state of California are beginning to get acquitted. We've had acquittals in Shasta County with the Rick 11 case of 40 marijuana plants grown outdoors by a patient, and he was acquitted. We've just had a case of James Hall and his mother Lydia Hall. And I asked poor Dave Herrick over there. Because we're seeing the caregivers being prosecuted. We're seeing those who are supporting the patients being prosecuted. We're seeing advocates being prosecuted like Steve Cubby and others who have come out in favor. It's Marvin Chavez, who's in jail right now for distributing medical marijuana, and again, the jury not allowed to hear the details of the case. So what they'll do is any patient with caught with medical marijuana is automatically charged with intent to distribute. And there's nothing tougher to prove than what your intentions was or what you were thinking about. And so this is a way that they're using to try to undermine the law. But the voters of California have taken this into their hands twice. Once at the ballot box and again in the jury box. And so all of you here today, I want to thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you for caring enough to show up today.
And what about freedom of religion? Okay, where
religion
includes
and so I encourage you all to remember one very important thing, that when you talk about patients like Tom McCormick and Peter McWilliams, or any patients, that these people are not the exception, that this is an ongoing policy. my wife Mickey Norris and myself have written a book with a friend of ours, Virginia Resner, called Shattered Lies, Portraits from America's Drug War, that chronicles over 100 cases of people who were in prison, who didn't get a fair trial, who were charged with things that they didn't do, who were brought in on broad conspiracy charges, etc., etc. So this is not a fluke, this is the policy, and it's up to us, the voters, up to us, the jurists, up to us, the people of California, to make sure that this goes forward. Thank you for joining with me today in solidarity with Todd and with Peter, with all the patients and with all the caregivers, and for those in other countries like Renee Bourget. And don't forget people like Renee Bourget, who's being dragged, they're trying to drag her back from Canada in order to send her to prison for Tom McCormick's decision to grow a research crop of marijuana. It's time for America to recognize the fundamental human rights of its own people and to dismantle the violations of these human rights on its own people rather than trying to criticize other people. I don't want to get religious on you, but there's this comment in the Bible that says to remove the log from your own eye before you try to remove the sliver from your neighbor's eye. And so that's what it's time that we all do, is start taking care of one another, standing up for one another, working together, and holding law enforcement to obey the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Praise Haile Selassie. Praise Haile Selassie.
I would like to thank Chris for speaking. You know, I'm not sure if everybody is aware of the section codes, but I want to make sure that you're aware. Section code 11362.5b states, to ensure that patients and their primary caregivers who obtain and use medical marijuana for medical purposes upon the request or the recommendation of their physician are not, and I repeat, are not subject to criminal prosecution or sanction. If this law is true, then tell me, why is California not enforcing this law? This is a section code. These patients should not be in jail. They should be at home with their families. What message are we sending to our kids when we have sick people that have cancer and they're at home with their children and the police come in and raid their children? Their children are taught that their parents are taking medication, just like the seizure pills, just like all the drugs that they have to take if they have AIDS. There's numerous pills and numerous medications that make patients very, very ill. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease itself. And this is not right. The patient should have the right to have their medicine. And I would like to ask everybody in California to please tell California this is wrong. This should stop. This is not right. The patients need to be sent home. And that is the bottom line. I would also now like to introduce you to Jim Silva, who is a defense attorney in Venice.
Here's a logistical problem, folks, is that there's a...
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, number one, I'd like to thank everybody who's shown up here today. It is a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with the people who have really been the source of this movement, and this is unquestionably a movement in California that has spread all across the United States, and I'm very proud to be among you today. I am a defense attorney, and I gotta tell you, in 1996, we fired a bow across the ship of the drug war when Health and Safety Code 11362.5 was enacted. We passed a medical marijuana law in California that was unprecedented and gave people a lot of rights. But at the same time, everybody who is a patient that uses marijuana for medical purposes, in addition to having to have a doctor, unfortunately in many circumstances also has to have a lawyer. And they're the only patients in the world who, in addition to having a medical provider, also need a lawyer. And that's because the law that was passed in California is an enabling statute. It's a statute that calls upon our legislature and calls upon our law enforcement to enact further laws in order to enact the law. It itself is not the end that we're looking for. It's a long road that we're going to have to travel down before we actually all have the protections, all that we have the protections that we'll need.
He didn't smoke marijuana. He didn't interrupt you when they were trying to speak either.
There are many people right now, including Marvin Chavez, who I was one of the defense attorneys for in Orange County, that currently sit in prison. There are many people who suffer from bona fide illnesses, who have gotten their physicians to get behind them, who have been subject to prosecution counter to the actual letter of the law. And that's because, and each and every one of you must understand, that the law that was passed in California, albeit it does give you certain rights, is also a very hotly politically contested issue in California. In order for you to continue to assert your rights, in order for you to continue to have rights under this law, you have to understand what it empowers you to do.
You don't need a doctor to know what your rights are, I'll tell you that much.
But one thing that you never ever want to have to be subject to is prosecution. You never ever want to be in a position where you could be arrested. Because if you are, and under the current state of the law, you still could be put in handcuffs, forced into a cage, forced to post a bond, forced to hire a defense attorney, forced to be put in front of a public forum where you're forced to reveal what your condition is. And that is a travesty. Nobody should have to be put through that. So in addition to being medical marijuana patients, one thing that everybody also needs to know is that the police are not your enemy. And the prosecutors are not your enemy. I have been on the front lines in the courtrooms where I have met many of the prosecutors and many of the officers, and many of them have told me that they don't have a problem with medical marijuana as a law in California. But unfortunately, they're just doing their jobs. And that's the travesty. They're just doing their jobs. So one thing that everybody who uses marijuana for medical purposes needs to know is how to comply with the law. Number one, you must have a physician who diagnoses you with a condition for which he would recommend or approve your use of marijuana. If you do not, then you are not entitled to the protections under the law at this point in time. Number two, if you are endeavoring to provide marijuana to somebody else, then you must qualify as their primary caregiver. And that definition has been the subject which has forced people into cages more than any other aspect of this law. In order to be somebody's primary caregiver, you must first provide on a consistent basis for their health, housing, or safety. And our courts have already said that providing somebody with medicine is not providing for their health. And that is a hallmark of how politically hot this particular issue is. When the courts themselves will say that providing somebody with medicine is not providing them for their health and safety is a travesty. I'd like to ask this gentleman right here if he could just step away, because you're distracting a lot of people who need to hear what's being said here today. People who are standing here today, the people who are standing here today are supporting people who are being incarcerated. And you're providing a big distraction. So you're not helping. You're part of the problem. You're not helping. One thing that I would also like to impress upon everybody is that the people who are the patients who are entitled to the rights under this law need to know how to have to deal with law enforcement. If you ever encounter law enforcement and you are a medical patient who uses marijuana for medical purposes, one other right that you need to know that you have is the right to remain silent. One of the biggest problems that medical marijuana patients have had in the course of this law's existence is that they feel that they are entitled to the protections that the law affords them, and they're right. But the practical reality is that the law enforcement officers who encounter you are unaccustomed to seeing people with marijuana patients who have a right to have them. You do not have to let them into your homes. You do not have to divulge to them anything. You must remain silent, and you must behold your right to remain silent 100%. Because you can still be subject to prosecution, and that's where lawyers like myself, other good people like Bill Panzer, there's another lawyer here today, Jeff, that's where we come in. Anyway, I would like to thank everyone very much for coming out here today and for supporting Todd McClure.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
Push the button.
Hello. Thank everybody for coming here today to show support for some of the people that are putting their lives on the front lines to fight for the freedom of everybody standing here right now.
Closer to your mouth.
I have a few of Todd's books here today. If anybody's interested in purchasing a book and reading and getting a good education about why he's in jail right now, it was for researching this book.
How much is it?
It's $10.
Only $10?
Wow, that's great!
Does the money go to help the cause?
It goes to help fight the cause. It helps to keep people out of jail. This money right here for this book right now is helping to pay for some of the costs incurred for him being in jail right now, like collect phone calls and putting money on his books to make sure that he can have food available to him. He's a vegetarian, and they don't really serve any meals that don't have meat in them in jail. So he has to buy all of his food off the commissary, and you have to have money on the books for that.
So the book,
So the book right here. Ask me questions.
How does it feel to have the man you love in jail, in prison right now, and facing practically a death penalty, a death sentence, and being subject to this torture and this unfairness and this injustice when he, in genuine good belief, believed that he was never going to face that?
It's really hard right now because when we were doing what we were doing up on Stone Canyon, his biggest pride was the fact that he didn't have to hide what he was doing because what he was doing was completely legal. He came back from Holland to do this in the United States because the laws had changed. And just as when the helmet law changed when you're able to ride motorcycles, the very next day you had to have a helmet on. And you had to have that or you were going to be arrested and get a ticket. And he thought that when the laws changed that made medical marijuana legal for people that need it, he thought that meant the very next day that meant that no more people would be arrested for going to jail for doing something that is legal for them to do in the state of California. What's happening right now is right along the lines of the Civil War. It's states' rights versus federal rights, and the federal government is not supposed to supersede our state law. Our state law is supposed to supersede our federal law, and the only thing the federal government is to do is to implement the unity of our states and to make sure that we stay unified and to make sure that when states have conflict between themselves, that is when the government is to step in. Not to say that we don't like your laws and we're going to stop your government from keeping people out of jail. We're going to force them to take people to jail for doing something that the state is considered legal. That's grounds for a civil war. I don't think we need to have guns or any violence, but right now there's a war on our people, and people are ignoring that. Nobody ignored the Vietnam War. We have prisoners of war, just like any other war, and we need to let the people out. We need to get the people out of jail. And it's ridiculous that in the United States of America, we have more of our population in prison per number of people that there are in the United States than any other country. And we consider ourselves a free country, but we're putting more people in jail for our percentage of our population than any other country right now. And it's not right. Especially when the people are sick. And they're arresting the weakest people in our civilization. They're not taking the strong. They're going after the sickest, weakest people that can't afford attorneys. And they're putting them in jail and they're making money on them. Thank you very much.
Free Todd McCormick!
I would like to invite everybody to the motion to allow Todd out on house arrest. He's in jail right now. They've revoked his bond. And we're trying to get him out of the system and allow him to remain on house arrest until the appeal that is going before the Ninth Circuit, asking to supersede the judge's decision and allow him to tell his jury that he has had cancer 10 times, and allow him to tell his jury that the person that supported and gave him the book advance for this is dying of AIDS. Allow him to tell his jury that what he was doing in the state of California is completely legal, and those things his judge denied him. And we're going to take that to the Ninth Circuit and get that overturned. Wednesday at the Roy Ball Federal Courthouse, at 255 Temple Street, East Temple Street, downtown Los Angeles, on the 6th floor in Judge King's courtroom. We're going to have a motion. I'd like everybody to be there in court attire. Wednesday the 30th. I don't know the time, but you can check on at 9 o'clock in the morning, most likely, either 9 or 3. What website can they check?
9 o'clock.
Be there 9 o'clock in the morning. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for showing your support. I'm selling books over here in the corner if anybody would like one. Is Todd's mom here?
Yes.
And Todd's mother's here right now. She's more seasoned at speaking about this issue than I am, and she has a fiery, zesty personality, and I think you all enjoyed hearing a few words from Ann McCormick.
I would again like to ask everybody to kind of move down a little bit more. We've been asked jet-lagged, and I've been losing my voice all day, so I'm going to make this very, very short and sweet. But I was really impressed when I came here yesterday about all the political advertisements on your TV show, on stations. And I want everyone to really take the time to think about how much power we really have if we work together. And this is an election year, and it's a good opportunity for us to really get our message out there and force this to become a campaign issue in the national campaigns this fall. So, I want to thank you all, and I know Todd is very grateful for all the support that everyone has shown him, and all the compassion and love that has been extended to him, and I echo that also. So thank you very much for coming, and just get active, and together we can make a difference.
Buy some roses.
If you're interested in getting one of the roses, we're asking for a $5 donation. The proceeds, 50% of it, actually these roses here go to all the development and the costs that we've expended to put this vigil on today. And I would also...
It's really hard to talk over all the noise, and I'm just going to do the best I can. I'm a doctor of immunology and a doctor of biochemistry, and I want to make this personal. How many of you voted for Prop 215? Okay, so did I. And guess what? Surprise, surprise. One day, I get a gallstone, it blows up my pancreas, I'm in the hospital, and I go from 180 to 120 pounds. I'm in extremis and I'm dying. And my doctor, who's right here in Santa Monica, says, Dr. Kavanaugh, you need to smoke marijuana so you can gain the weight back, so you can eat. And it's too painful to eat when you have acute pancreatitis. And I said, great, can I have a prescription? He said, no, 215 doesn't allow for that. I said, well, can I have a letter of recommendation? He said, I'd love to give it to you, but those men from the DEA will take away my license. I said, well, doctor, what am I supposed to do? He said, do it like everyone else and buy it off the street. So me, a respectable citizen, is supposed to become a drug criminal subject to arrest, despite the fact that the majority of Californians voted to make medical marijuana available for such as me. Now, do I look 120 pounds anymore? I think I look okay. And it's because I told the feds, screw you. Basically, I've got to save my own life. We have patients like myself all over the country who are seeking to establish their rights to take medical marijuana. I'm not into getting high. I'm not a hipster. Stuff makes me cough so bad. It's just awful. I hear I can bake it. But what if this were to happen to you? And what if the only drugs available to you were the highly toxic drugs that are used in cancer and in AIDS, and you had to be puking your guts out every day? And wouldn't you want someone to be able to help you with medical marijuana? I'll tell you where I got mine. I got mine because my 78-year-old mother went and scored me a lid at her bridge club. That's what I had to do. This is nuts. This is the state of California, and we have a state law to help patients like myself. so that we don't go to the black market, so we aren't hauled off into jail, so we can grow a few plants in our yard for ourselves or for our friends who qualify. And if we don't fight for this right, the police will not let us keep it. What I want you to do today is remember your city councilman, remember your state senator or your state assemblyman, and write them a letter saying we voted for 215. Now you guys make it work. Please make it work. Thank you.
Well, we can't do that. We can't follow your will. What message are we sending to our kids? Well, you know, some kids are being told with this message that they'd rather be seen dead. Okay? There are children that need this plant, children that Todd has worked with. Okay? So that has to be asked back at them. What message are we sending to our children? The other thing is, a badge is not a license to practice medicine. Never has been, never will be. They have no expertise. They have no education in it. They don't have a degree in herbology or pharmacology or anything. So their decision on what's too many or not plants is ridiculous. It's foundless. Okay? It's basisless. So, we have to have everybody write their letters and stand up for this. You've got to get out in the street, because if they can do it to someone who smokes an herb that comes out of the ground, they can do it to anybody. So remember that. Thank you all for coming.
Can I add one thing?
And Ann has one more thing to say.
You know, I'm a member of the generation that grew up during the 50s and 60s, and I went through that whole thing where we had to sit under our desks and wait for the bombs to drop, and it never would have occurred to me in those days that I would ever be facing a situation where my son was facing imprisonment for gardening. And this is exactly what it comes down to. Todd is not a violent person. He's not a bad person. He would never steal from you. He would never hurt you. But he is going to jail because of gardening. And that is really the bottom line. So, I mean, if something that would sound that absurd can happen in an average American family like ours, it can happen in any family anywhere across the nation. And, you know, the war on drugs is really tearing apart the American family. And I really can't reconcile in my own mind how people that swear to care about family values would allow children and families to be victimized by the legal system, probably to a degree far more dangerous than the drugs themselves. And that was just a little afterthought that I wanted to add, and thank you for your indulgence.
Maybe I need to project a little more. It's not about whether or not there is medical use involved in my whole thought pattern, because number one, we have all known for a long time that it does provide unbelievable relief, okay? I don't need to go into that. The United States government has put together their own study. The study went forth. They wanted to show that marijuana was a gateway drug. Got news for you. Their $900,000 study that was put together stated, the final result stated that indeed alcohol and tobacco are gateway drug, not marijuana. We're talking about getting personal a little bit today. Yes, indeed. The first Marlboro cigarette I had was straight out of a Safeway in 4th grade. 6th grade, the Pabst Blue Ribbon came off Mom's refrigerator door. Okay? Years later, yes, marijuana did enter. And now again, marijuana has entered. I am ready for an officer to tell me, I don't make the laws, I just enforce them. Well, guess what, officers? We do make the laws. We do enforce them. You help make the laws if you vote. All right? This issue is no more about medical marijuana than the Boston Tea Party was about tea. That is Michelle Cubby's quote, who is now, as of this next week, in Placer County, in this golden state of California that passed Proposition 215, going to court after a year of the prosecution trying spending $1 million trying to come up with information to show a sale. Got news for you, Mr. Prosecutor. You're not going to find one.